Bergson wants to show us that language, quantity, concepts, symbols, all of this tools that we use to think and understand the world and get around in the world in our practical everyday life and in order to do science, that these tools end up distorting our view of consciousness and of our experience of time in particular. So the first thing Bergson tries to do in chapter 1 is to lay a basic framework in which he attempts to bring us to an intuition, a glimpse, a experiential grasp of what he calls intensity. He does this in order to criticize what he sees as tendencies within the scholarship in psychology and physiology of his time, particularly two different branches, you might say, two different schools. One is what we could call intellectualist. These were people who followed in the Kantian tradition. They were neo-Kantian philosophers, people like Fechner and a bunch of other, Weber and some other people. And he isn't completely rejecting them, but he's trying to criticize the way in which they interpret what their findings are and their framework. And the other group of physiologists and psychologists that he wants to critique are those of reductive empiricism. So these are the kind of two paths. You can think of it as like the Kantian, the school of Kantian philosophy following after Kant, and the kind of Humean, David Hume, this kind of empiricist tradition that comes and really approaches psychology and physiology in this reductive way, and this evolves into things like behavioralism. So Bergson wants to find a middle path in a way between these, and he does this by, again, turning our attention to intensity and critiquing the way that intensity is understood in these other two traditions. So he wants to show us that intensity in deep aesthetic experiences and moral experiences, these deep sentiments, the feeling of intensity cannot be reduced to the quantity of an external stimuli. And this was something that was really big in his time in physiology, and it even kind of continues in today, although people like Merleau-Ponty and Gestalt psychology have continued this critique, and others beyond them, into the 21st century. So these empiricist physiologists do these experiments where they have a light source and they increase the voltage a little bit, that's 3 whatever volts, and then that increases the stimuli, and that then should correlatively increase the intensity of the experience. And what they did basically was to try to figure out what is called the minimal sensible difference. How much do we have to increase that stimuli until the patient notices that there's a difference? And then we can calculate that number, create a constant from it, and this is what Weber and Fechner do. And then we can translate basically the intensity of feeling into a quantity of stimuli. And Bergson wants to show that while there are certain applications for this kind of method, and it does have certain scientific validity, it should not be used as fundamental in understanding the reality of intensity as a lived experience. And that's really what Bergson is interested in. And then, again, showing how that whole framework distorts the rest of our understanding of psychic life and completely makes the experience of free will impossible. Bergson points us to a type of intensity which doesn't have a correlate with an external quantity of change. And he points to aesthetic experiences first. In these experiences, there's a gradual evolution of our feeling. There's not just a simple arithmetic difference between one moment and another moment. We can think about a couple different aspects of aesthetic experiences here that Bergson brings up. One is the idea of charm. And we've seen this already with Jankelevich, and he picks this up from Bergson. But a charm is something which grabs our attention, right? It sucks us in. It makes us interested. It concentrates our attention, and it intensifies our engagement with the spectacle, right? And that intensifying of the engagement is not produced by an external stimuli. And very closely related to the idea of charm is the idea of grace. And grace is when you see movements that flow together and where intentionality is sort of perfectly or gracefully executing these movements. When we see this, it draws us in, right? It has a charm to it. It grabs our attention and it intensifies our experience of the situation gradually over time by, in a way, modulating our attitude and our attunement, right? The intensity here is in the transformation of our consciousness rather than in the things in the world. And this is really obvious in listening to music. Our intensity of enjoyment and the aesthetic intensity that we feel in this experience is not reducible to how loud the music is or how fast it is or anything like that. Obviously, loudness, speed, like the speed and all of these things, they can intensify certain aspects. And when we talk about intense music, we mean like metal or really fast like violin playing or something like that. But that doesn't exhaust what we mean by an intensely beautiful or an intensely graceful or an intensely charming music, right? Our interest and our involvement and our engagement in that music is not reducible to that external stimuli. And Bergson also talks a lot here about the idea of suggestion. And suggestion is something that really can't be reduced to an external stimuli either. When we get in this, we have to get in the mood to have the music's suggestiveness come to us. The rhythm and the monotony of the melody, and I don't mean monotony in a negative way, just the repetitiveness of it, sucks us in, it lulls us, it charms us again in the other meaning of charm, which is kind of like a magical spell that it casts on us. We get sucked into the music, and that opens us up to the suggestiveness of the music, such that once we're in that state, then you have the saxophone, played by Jonathan, of course, go, and it sounds like someone crying, and all of a sudden we're crying, right? And that's because it altered our attunement, it altered our attitude, and made us in this highly suggestive state. And that state is what Bergson is most interested in this book. When we feel these deep emotions, when we're sucked into these intense feelings, they're ineffable, they're difficult to describe. Now, we do describe them, and when we describe them, those descriptions are really only meaningful to other people who have experienced those feelings, right? I can describe this sublime feeling of listening to Mozart or something like that, and that description is really only useful to someone who has had a similar experience, and it evokes and suggests that experience. But when we try to talk about these things in terms of quantities, we really enter a whole new terrain. And Bergson wants to give us an explanation of why we do that. If I say to someone, Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven is a 10 out of 10. Like, that doesn't tell them anything about the quality of that song, the experience of it, its qualitative nuances, right? What makes that song unique against any other song, and what it feels like to listen to that song. But it communicates something. I mean, it's not an empty statement. It says, wow, this person really likes this song, and it gave him a great experience. So there is something useful in this, and we can think in clinical settings and for doctors and things. You say, how much pain did this 1 to 10, how much pain, or whatever. And that does communicate something helpful. Of course, pain doesn't come in one variety that is just differences of degree. There are qualitatively different pains. There's dull pain, there's sharp pain, a myriad of different other pains. There's very, localized pains. There's more diffuse types of pain. And there's moral pain. You see somebody suffering and you feel indignation, you feel the need to right a wrong, the type of pain we feel in front of injustice and things like that. And then there's pain of, loss and sorrow, and so there's 100 different kinds of pain or more. And even two of the same type of pain will be different based on the nuances of our life. And this is the kind of thing Bergson is really trying to sink his teeth into, right? Like, when I feel, the pain of being dumped in high school, is very different than the pain of losing a loved one when you're older in life or something like that. And the nuances there are always different, and they feed into that emotion and they shape that emotion. And so Bergson is trying to push us back towards that qualitatively complex reality of emotion, which he calls qualitative multiplicity. So again, why do we convert these realities of qualitative multiplicity into numbers? Well, in order to communicate them, right? That was the first thing we said. But how did we get there? How did we start doing that? Bergson thinks that it has a physiological and, you might say, embodied phenomenological reason. We calculate how much force and how much effort we put into our motricity, our getting around in the world, our moving our bodies, right? When I lift a book, I roughly, vaguely understand I need to lift it with this much force, and I can contrast that in my imagination with how much it's going to take to lift something really heavy, like this large box or some luggage or something. And, if you go to pick up some luggage that you think is really heavy, but then it's empty, you lift it and you're like, oh my gosh, I thought that was heavy and it wasn't, right? So in those estimations, we begin to convert what is an interior feeling and an intention into something exterior. This idea of a quantity of, force, basically. And it's based on those ideas of quantity of force that we become accustomed to converting our interior quality of experience into an external quantity of force or stimuli. So again, Bergson is not saying that numbers are bad or that quantifying things is bad. He's saying that it's something that we do for practical reasons. It's something that we do in order to communicate, but that it always covers over and loses something of the quality and the complexity and the depth and the detail and the nuance of our inner experience. And that what we really must not do is base our understanding of psychology and metaphysics and ontology on this practical, approximating, quantifying activity.